Hola, buenos días. Bienvenidos a todas y a todos al segundo día de las jornadas de videojuegos de Barreira. Hoy vamos a arrancar con un Q&A con Brad Kane, que lo tenemos aquí detrás. Brad es guionista interactivo y ha trabajado en proyectos tan interesantes como Ghost of Tsushima, una película interactiva de Netflix, Animals of the Loose, The Walking Dead, el videojuego, y Minecraft Story Mode. Además, él ha trabajado como director en Pixar, en Cars, Wall-E y Toy Story 3, y está ahora también trabajando para un estudio londinense, Interior Night, desarrollando juegos narrativos como As Dusk Falls. Entonces, nada, espero que os resulte muy interesante y cuando Brad quiera. Brad, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Pues whenever you want.
Great, and I think even through my limited Spanish, I was able to understand my bio there, so I won't repeat too much of it, but I'm Brad. It's nice to see all of you here. I am, as Anna said, a screenwriter and narrative designer working in interactive storytelling. I was the original story lead on Ghost of Tsushima, building out the world and the story structure of that game before the writing team came on. I wrote recently a pair of Netflix interactive movies with Bear Grylls, including the one that just came out, Animals on the Loose. And I worked on several Telltale game franchises, as you just heard, Walking Dead, Minecraft Story Mode, Game of Thrones, and I'm working on some new projects now. And I thought I would just quickly tell you how I got here and kind of what it means to me that I'm doing this interactive screenwriting. I've been screenwriting and playing video games for most of my life. The first script that I wrote, I was 16 years old, living in LA, which is a lucky place to be if you want to write scripts. And I wrote a spec script for Star Trek: The Next Generation. I was kind of a geek at that age, as one tends to be to go into games. And I wrote a script, and I had the good fortune to get it read by someone at Universal Studios, which at the time seemed like a great thing. What I didn't know was that Universal doesn't make that show. It's Paramount. So it was actually a favor from a family friend. But it felt like great to be able to have someone read something I read and even to give me some encouragement. It was, in retrospect, terrible. But it showed me that if you put the energy in, you can put written stuff out into the world. And meanwhile, I was a kind of an early gamer. The first thing I ever bought was a Super Nintendo. And in the late 90s, we started to see games and story really start to come together with games like Final Fantasy VII and some of the things that happened kind of in that era. And it was an exciting time for me as someone kind of just coming out of college to be able to say, this is something I'd like to do. I want to go into this new field of games and animation. So after college, I got a job as a journalist and editor for a website called gamasutra.com, which is still out there now. It's a business and tech journal, basically, for video games. And early on, I was just kind of curating content, writing some game reviews, and I was particularly interested in what was a new area, the intersection of games and story. There wasn't a whole lot going on in that field. People weren't really thinking about it, but I was interested in it, and I just kind of followed the thread on that. And strangely, it led me away from games and it led me into animation, which was something I'd been interested in. And I got a few jobs in a row as a production manager, feature film production manager, or production assistant, really, which means getting the car washed and buying the coffee for the important people. But I took really low paid jobs for a while just to be close to these movies that were getting made, which at the time, animation was this new thing. We'd had Toy Story and a couple of movies, but it was a really exciting time. I worked on Shrek and Madagascar and some of these early films and got to see incredible creative professionals at the height of their career doing what they do best. I worked at Pixar with people like Andrew Stanton and Pete Docter and Brad Bird. And more than anything, being with these people, these creators, while they did their creation was an education by osmosis. And I really got to see not just how a great creative creates, but how they do it in collaboration with a team, because there's, the Pixar creative pipeline, the brain trust there is legendary. And I learned that any great project is made by a team. It's rare that someone comes along and just has a vision. Of course, it happens. There's the James Camerons of the world, but mostly we make things as studios. And I really took that on board. And when I eventually ventured out on my own after 5 years at Pixar, wanting to be a screenwriter, which at this point I'd been writing for a lot of my life. I'd taken master's level classes while I was working at Pixar. I was able to study screenwriting with teachers at UCLA. When I finally ventured out and I brought that skill to studios and production companies in Hollywood, I was also able to bring to them a sense of how you get things done, how you work as a team, how you collaborate, how you listen to others, and how you bake the bread together, because most of the time we don't do it alone. And with all of that excellent wisdom, I accomplished pretty much nothing, which is what most people experience when they go to Hollywood. It's very hard to get something made. I wrote some great scripts. I had great relationships. I even got to develop a really cool project called The Wheel of Time, based on a series of fantasy books. It's now a TV show coming to Amazon next year. So I did some great stuff, but Hollywood is a difficult place to get anything actually made. And as I kind of explored the full circle of where my career was headed and where my kind of life had led me, I really started to think about games again. And I'd always felt that there was something about the interactive format that was unique and special. In high school, I loved math. I loved just the complex logic of calculus. And it's true that even writing a screenplay, for those of you who have ever tried to write a screenplay, can be a great big logic problem. But the logic problem that is an interactive story is many times more complicated. And I found that really appealing. And at the same time, I had friends who had started to move into games, and everything sort of came together. And I eventually, one day, got an opportunity to work at Telltale Games, and the game part of my career kicked off. But it made a lot of sense. It was kind of something that I'd been building for a long time, something I had been working toward without knowing it. And since then, I've had the good fortune to keep working on great game projects. Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, Minecraft Story Mode, a bunch of little things you might not have heard of, some VR games, some educational games. There's a lot of things that get made that need what we do, what interactive storytellers do. And I think that the thing I've learned more than anything is no two games are ever the same. No two projects are the same. There's always a unique set of challenges and opportunities on each new project, because the nature of interactivity is such that it always breaks what you think you know about storytelling. Whatever you've learned from a book or from a class or from a Robert McKee workshop about stories and characters and character arcs and world building and setting, it all just gets broken once you get the player in there, because what you need to do if you're introducing interactivity into a story is give the player an opportunity, or the user. At Netflix, they like to call them users. Give the user agency, the ability to actually do something in this story. Well, it turns out that letting a user or a player control your story is the exact opposite of what you want to do as a screenwriter, which is you want to tell a great story. And that fight, that epic struggle between story and design, I would say is really the heart of what it means to be in the field of interactive storytelling. Whether you call yourself a writer or a narrative designer or an interactive screenwriter, which is the term I came up with because I just like how it sounds, it's essentially all about that. It's how do I balance storytelling, the skill, with game design or gameplay, or the need for the user to have an experience. So that's what I do. I take on a new project every few years. I did Ghost of Tsushima for Sony and Sucker Punch in Seattle. Then I had an opportunity to work on this game I'm working on now, As Dusk Falls, for Interior Night in London. I do some other things on the side, and I'm currently doing it all overseas while my wife teaches at a school here in Bali, Indonesia. And that's sort of the short version of my journey, and there's a lot more I could say, but why don't we open it up to you guys? I'm really interested to hear what kinds of questions you have and help you understand anything I can about this field.
¿Quieres ver las preguntas por si tienes alguna duda o paso directamente el micro? Vale, el primero es Raúl. Vale, chicos, pues voy a pasar ahora el micro, ¿de acuerdo? A ver, Raúl, ¿dónde está Raúl? De acuerdo. Vale, pues vamos haciendo las preguntas por turnos. Un segundo. Pregunta, la primera. Ahí lo tienes.
What was the best company to work with?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to say Pixar. And the reason is, well, two things. Like I said, the creatives at Pixar they've developed a system there, what they call the Pixar Brain Trust, which is this way of vetting each other's work. Every director on a film has to show his film to every other director pretty regularly, every 2 months, and that means on storyboards, not necessarily actually animated frames, but they find ways to share, and they basically get in the room, a safe space, and they tear each other's work apart. They just deconstruct and say, this is not working, the second act is really boring, I don't like the way these characters are coming together, I think you suck, basically. And they've got a certain magic combination of freedom, creative freedom, and also like trust and respect in each other and in each other's notes that many studios have tried to copy since then. And I think the only studio that's really done it is Marvel, which also now is under the Disney umbrella. They also have a really healthy collaboration going on there. But being part of that was really special. The other thing that Pixar did really well is they offer their employees sort of continuing education within the company through something called Pixar University, where they actively want to educate you in different skills involved in filmmaking, whether it's directing or screenwriting or acting, improv classes, and sometimes just random stuff like ceramics or Chinese calligraphy. And that is such a gift to give to an employee. I used it to take screenwriting classes. I know other people who did the same thing. They really helped elevate me above and beyond what I was doing for them to be able to do something more for myself. And I'll always be thankful to them for having the guts to have a program that might ultimately mean their employees leave because they become, they grow bigger than the company. A lot of times they grew into new roles in the company, but it was a pretty special place, and I'm glad I worked there.
Okay, thank you, Brad.
Sure.
Next question. So, Catherine.
Hello, and I want to ask you how difficult it was to make the Ghost of Tsushima story.
Yeah, hey, Catherine. In a way, it was like making any story because, every story is a collection of nonsense until you figure out how to put all the pieces together. With Ghost, it had a little bit of the work done for me because when I came in, they had already been thinking about this world, some of these characters and some of these plot elements for years before I got there. My job was to take all that and assemble it, to structure it, come up with how do we actually tell this story in a way that's powerful and emotional. The ideas were in place, but the story, the deep structure that makes a story wasn't. So a lot of what I did when I was working on that was putting note cards up on a board and just figuring out what order things would have to happen in and how the characters could get introduced. And then the tricky part of a game like Ghost, which is an open world game, is how you also tell side stories, what they call Silver Quest stories at Sucker Punch. How do you tell those side stories that run parallel to the main story without interfering with the main story? Because what you might have in a game like that is you've got your main story. Let's call it 30 chapters of the character going through a series of steps on a character arc toward a final confrontation and a climax. That's a pretty typical story path, and that's true of a movie or a TV series or any kind of linear entertainment medium. But what you have in an open world game is there are these other stories that happen alongside it. You follow the sensei who has had a rebellion from his student, for instance. And there's a whole storyline with that character. And when the player chooses to pursue that storyline, it doesn't necessarily have any correspondence to the main story. So if you're trying to draw an arc for your character and saying, well, Jin starts off thinking he wants to be loyal to his uncle and to his island, and by the end, he's going to be an independent, ghost. He's going to become that ghost character. Where does Jin fall on that spectrum when he starts the Ishikawa storyline? You don't know, because you don't know when the player is going to do it. So figuring out not just the structure of the story, but how to structure the relationship between the protagonist and those storylines is part of the challenge. And in that case, for instance, we realized we just can't focus on the main character in the storylines. We really have to focus on the secondary characters. It seems obvious now, but that kind of thinking, how to build narrative structures that work within the context of the game you're trying to make, ends up being a lot of the challenge. So I'll put an asterisk on my answer to this question and say, how difficult was it to make Ghost of Tsushima? There was another team of writers who did the heavy lifting. I didn't write the game. I outlined the story for the game and handed it over to another group of guys who then sat in the trenches for 3 years and did the work. So you probably have to ask them how difficult it got. But I can speak to the story structure step, and that's kind of everything I just said. Good.
And what period? Excuse me. And what period of your career was the most fun?
I really like collaboration. I like getting into a room with people, tossing ideas around. We did that well at Telltale Games, getting in a room, 3 or 4 people, just spitting ideas for a few hours, and it gets really silly. If you knew some of the things we talked about on Game of Thrones, you'd all be laughing because it's terrible for the most part and funny. And I really like that sort of just creative banter. So any project that gets a lot of people together, my current project in London is like that, is a lot of fun for me.
Okay, thank you, Brad. So next question.
Hello. How do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do I see myself in 10 years' time? Well, I hope that I grow with the industry. And I say that because I think the industry itself is going to be really different in 10 years' time. We've started to come into a place of really great storytelling in the last 5-7 years or so, but I still think we're just at the beginning of it. We're still, because of the nature of gamepads, I think we're still focused on these destructive stories for the most part. You're usually playing a killer of some kind, not always, but I'd like to see the industry telling stories that matter more, that inspire and lift people up more. There's great things happening in television. We're in a golden age of what they call prestige TV. Some of the shows that we see these days are like what film was 20 years ago. And I think that games has a lot more room to grow to get to its own golden age. And I'd like to see myself grow with that and be able to tell stories that matter and that feel like they represent the best of what we have to offer as storytellers.
Okay, thanks for that. So Alicia is going to make the next question.
Hi, I have a question. What is the biggest difficulty you had in your career?
Difficulties. Well, I mean, in some sense, difficulty is the nature of the work. Anyone who says that they've made it and that they're through the tough times is not being honest, because it's always hard, and there's always some difficulty going on. But if I had to identify one time, I think it's, I talked about when I made that decision to launch out on my own, leave the comfy job at Pixar and make it as a screenwriter. And the conventional wisdom is always the same. Don't do that. Bad idea. You're not going to make money. You're probably going to end up working at a restaurant and you'll wait tables for the rest of your life. I don't like conventional wisdom. I didn't listen to that. I often don't. But there's some truth in it. And there were definitely a few years in there where my wife was supporting me. We had a new baby. It felt like maybe I had a reality check coming. Maybe I should have listened, and try to do this thing, be a working creative against all odds, seemed like probably an irresponsible thing, and maybe I needed to give it up. And there was, for me, there was definitely a dark night of the soul moment when I said, okay, I can't keep doing this. I have to be able to support the baby. And I went back to what I was doing before. I took a job working on a movie called Tomorrowland with Brad Bird on the visual effects team. And I thought to myself, this is it. I've kind of sacrificed what I wanted. But it's funny how things work. Sometimes you have to surrender before the floodgates of everything you've worked for can open. And in this case, 2 months into that gig, I got a call from a friend who asked if I wanted to come work on this game project. And the funny thing is, I didn't even say yes immediately, because sometimes you get into a space where you're doubting yourself, or you don't know if you've made the right decision or you're making the right decision, and you can really buy into that insecurity. But I worked through it, and I realized this is definitely what I want to do, and I went, and it's been great ever since then. But looking back at it, I think that it was a hard moment, and I think it's a hard moment that a lot of people face, is how long can I continue to afford to be true to what I want? And there's no easy answer to that, except to say that I think that you always have to find a way to be true to what you want, because if you're not true to yourself, what do you have left? So that's my little piece of wisdom for the hour.
Okay, thanks. So next question here.
Yeah.
How is the grunge from within?
Yeah, crunch culture. There's definitely a problem with crunch culture. If you know about the game industry, you've read about it, and you've read that people want to unionize. They don't want to have to work these crazy hours. It's a tricky thing, because you're working on a project. Everyone's a team. You've got a deadline. Games have a way of going wrong. They're very complicated projects. They're like spaceships or something. Like, there's just so many moving parts when you're building a video game. And most of the time, it's something that's never been done before. It's a kind of game that's never been done by a team that's never done anything like that. Things break, but the budget is the budget. You've got your studio publisher saying we need the game to ship by June. So you're invested. You're all in. You want to make this thing, and people do work hard. But the culture of crunch is. The best I can say about it is I choose to work to a certain point, and I won't make myself unhealthy working beyond that point. I think it's counterproductive for me to get exhausted and burned out, because I might develop a few extra scripts over a couple week period, but I'm not going to be any good after that. I think that's true for everybody, and the best antidote to crunch culture is just to know your boundaries and find a way to strongly but gracefully draw those on every project you work on. I hope that by the time you guys are leading games, this is less of an issue, because I think everyone's waking up to the fact that crunch is not healthy, and hopefully, as an industry, we are able to move away from it.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So Alejandro has the next question.
Hello. What's the
Hi.
worst thing that happened to you at the work?
Every time I get notes, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, every day. And it's also the best thing, because when you write, you have to believe in your stuff, and you think that your stuff is great until someone comes along and says, I think you wrote a bunch of garbage. And then you realize, oh, they're right, it's horrible. Why did I think this was any good? Luckily, someone read the material, told you before the game shipped, and gave you an opportunity to improve. And that cycle is the work. I mean, there's this cliche saying, writing is rewriting. It's a cliche because it's true. We write a script in a week maybe, but then we spend a year revising it again and again and again and iterating on it. And when you think you're finally done, and you've finally done the last version of it, you get notes back from the studio, and guess what? They want to change everything. And it's heartbreaking, and it's awful, and it can be really demoralizing, but it's the nature of the problem. It's the nature of the work. It's what it takes to really get something polished and refined. So, I know this wasn't really what you're asking, but I'm going to use a question as an opportunity to say that I think that the challenges are the opportunities when you're in creative work, and you have to really learn to embrace that sense of hardship, because without it, you don't grow as a creative, and your project is likely to end up being mediocre. You really have to commit to facing down the difficulty day after day until finally one day the game ships and hopefully you forget it ever happened.
Okay, Brad, thank you. So next question is for Catherine.
How do you see the future of the video game world?
Well, I think that anything that you see Netflix doing now, you're going to see the game industry doing in 5 to 10 years. So streaming is our future. I think that the PlayStation 5 and the current Xbox are possibly the last generation of hardware consoles from those companies. Maybe there'll be one more, but already Microsoft is working hard to make Game Pass, their subscription service, the way that people play games, because for them, the math works better if every person out there is paying $10, $15 a month for access to games than kind of getting them into this hardware cycle and trying to figure out who's going to upgrade or not. So I think we'll see streaming become a big deal for sure. And I think just like in film, we've seen a widening gap between the top level movies like the Avengers and the indies, because there used to be this whole mid-range of film that just doesn't get made anymore. I think that we'll probably see more of that kind of movement with AAA. And AAA, for those of you who don't know, is the equivalent of like the Hollywood top level movies, the most expensive games that get made. And it's for the same reason. It's that the companies investing in these games increasingly are the same companies that own the platforms, Sony, Microsoft. A lot of the big games you play over the course of a year are first party games, meaning that Sony or Microsoft owns them. And for that reason, they want to invest and make their projects as kind of big and notable as possible. So how much do we keep seeing a kind of a middle ground on that? I don't know. It's hard to say, because the other thing that's true is that Netflix at the same time is leading to a revival of a certain kind of project because they have the freedom. So I think that the short answer is we don't know what it's going to look like, but I think that certainly you're going to be able to boot up turn on your TV, pick up your controller, and jump into pretty much any game the same way you can with TV right now. And like I said earlier, I also hope that it's not just about how you play games, but what you play. I'd really like to see us making stories that are more important than just the latest zombie game or the latest war game. I think there's a lot of stories out there, and figuring out how to put players into the driver's seat of them is the challenge for us as interactive designers. But there's a lot we can do, and I'd really like to see the game industry bloom creatively in that way.
Okay, thank you. Next question here.
Is it hard to work with big companies?
Well, there's pros and cons, right? Whether you work with a studio or an independent developer. Like, what are some of the pros of working for a company like Sony or Microsoft or one of these big studios? You get the stability, of course, because they're a corporate company. You're going to get offered a nice salary, a benefits package, an office overlooking the office district of some city, perhaps. They have cool studios. Sucker Punch has cool space in Seattle. Pixar, another kind of big company, has really great physical space, and those companies have a greater ability to spotlight their product. Everyone plays the Sony games. Everyone knows about God of War. Everyone knows about The Last of Us. I have a friend who's writing at Pixar these days, and it's great for his visibility because everyone sees the movies he makes. But there's trade-offs. There's way more bureaucracy when you're at a big company. You have, even if you're the lead on a project, you've got studio stakeholders, you've got the people they report to at the company that runs them. So, if you're working at Naughty Dog making The Last of Us, you might be Neil Druckmann with a lot of freedom, but even so, you have to report to people at Sony, and there's a few layers of that. So there's definitely a lot more kind of red tape to deal with at a big company, levels of management. And I think at a big company, it can be harder to pivot if you find that your product, your game isn't going the way you were hoping it could go. There's expectations, and you've been funded up to a certain amount by this division of the company to make this game, to make the game you pitch them. You can't suddenly decide that you want your Western car racing game to become a space shooter. It is not as simple as that. You have to work within structures. So those are the pros and cons of big studios. On the flip side, you have a small studio, and there's a lot that people like about these small companies. You can make an impact more easily, be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, as it were. The studios are more dynamic. You can have a lot of fun in a small team, bring drinks to work or whatever. There's just a sense of like, it's just us and we're just doing it together in a scrappy way. But what are the trade-offs? The budgets are smaller, for sure. And you make a mistake, like you have a problem come up on a small project, there's a greater chance that it's going to shake the ship in a way that maybe the studio can't handle, or at least that causes a big problem. When you're at a big studio, a Sony or something, even if a game completely fails at Sony, they've got a whole portfolio of games they can balance those losses. A small company, you're putting everything on this one game, you have to get it right, so there's more pressure. So I think the original question, was it hard to work at big companies? I think that there are aspects of it that are much easier, and there's aspects of it that can be harder. And ultimately, it's a trade-off. And it has a lot to do with what you want creatively, what kind of lifestyle you want, and maybe how you feel about the project that you're working on. Because there's certainly projects that make it all the worthwhile to work at some big company. And conversely, there's projects that are being made at small developers that I wouldn't trade for anything, because those are some of the funnest that I've ever worked on.
Okay, thank you. So one more here.
Hello. As a narrative lead, was this long before you decided with your work team the script for The Walking Dead? So taking it took so much time to release a new chapter?
Do you mean that you say chapter? Do you mean like game 3 of the series, or do you mean the episodes within?
No, the first one.
Yeah. The time between games honestly has a lot more to do with decisions being made at the studio level than it does at the creative level. So you've got things like for instance, in that case, Telltale finished up Walking Dead season 2, and they had just gotten the rights to Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones was absolutely huge at that time. I think we were in the 4th season of the show, maybe the 3rd season, and there was a lot of energy put on, okay, we got to put the whole studio on the Game of Thrones now. And at the same time, they were trying to make Borderlands, and at the same time, they got this deal with Mojang to work on Minecraft. So the studio just turned its attention to other projects. It wasn't a reflection of The Walking Dead. In fact, The Walking Dead season 2 did spectacularly. It's just that there were other things going on. And it's often like that. There's, studio can't work on everything all at once. Naughty Dog can't work on Uncharted at the same time that it makes Last of Us 2. It's just, they only have a certain amount of bandwidth. There's also licensing considerations. Sometimes you get a deal, and the deal is you have to put out your game based on this IP within the next 2 years, or the deal's off. So suddenly the studio's racing to do that. So it was more about that. Once we got into the room and developed the idea for the game, I don't think it took any longer to get to a pilot episode on Walking Dead season 3 than it did on any other game. But it's worth mentioning that even then, the process can be really chaotic. I think we had episode 1 come out while we were still just kind of breaking episode 4 in the writer's room, and that model can be really tough, because you've committed to something with the first episode. I think we released our first 2 episodes simultaneously, and so those are out there, and now you have to honor that. And then on the back end, you're trying to figure out how to make the story work. You're like, oh shoot, I thought we were going to do this, but now we're doing this, but we've already committed to this. So yeah, there's I think that the where you see the time between chapters has tended to be more between episodes of an episodic game, and that's why Some of you may have seen that New Life is Strange game was announced recently, and they announced that they're not doing episodic anymore. They're going to release the whole thing in one chunk. And I think that's smart because when we do episodic games, we're kind of always just making a bargain with the devil, and it's usually tougher than it needs to be. So I like that companies are moving toward doing whole seasons, whole games at a time right now, and I hope we keep doing it that way.
Thank you, Brad. We have
Sure.
a question from people who are following us on YouTube. So
Cool.
they are asking, how is the experience of changing your professional role after working in game journalism? Did you feel it like being back to the square one?
I don't feel that way because I've never felt like it was like step off a cliff and start again from the bottom of the cliff. For me, it's very much it's like a spiraling climb or a spiraling journey. I was writing game articles at the same time that I was learning to produce animated movies. And in both of those, I was at square one at the same time. So I was kind of doing two careers at once. But as I moved through and into games, it just always felt like old things built on what I had learned. I don't know if you can see me gesticulating my spiral. But so I think it's more of a growth, like the way a tree might grow, strange and organic and with the roots twisted. But you never start from the beginning so much as you just translate what you know. Even if you're changing fields, going from being a programmer in like medical tech to being a programmer for video games, you still bring all that knowledge about programming, that experience about what it means to be a good coder. Or similarly, if you're in an industry but you're changing roles, you're going from QA tester for a game to trying to jump into game design, you still know quite a lot that you picked up as a tester. So it's unusual to see someone go from QA tester in games to programmer for medical tech. It's too many jumps, and I could see how it might feel discombobulating to try to do that. But I think that if you follow the path of a career, or at least in my case, I followed kind of the doors as they opened. It never felt like a restart so much as a bold new step in directions I was already aware of in my own trajectory, if that makes sense.
Sure. Okay, so that was the last question. So thank you very much for your time and
Sure.
for your precious advice. And I think that's it. No? One more question?
Yeah, happy to take more.
Well, hi. I don't really know how to say this. I would like to be a screenwriter, but I don't really know how to write stories. But I would like to tell a good one. So where do I start from?
You say you write stories, but if you think about it, you've been watching and digesting stories since you were a baby, probably. You've seen hundreds of movies, maybe read books or watch TV shows. And stories are in us. Like the structure of a story, the reason a story is structured the way it is because there's a certain pattern that makes a story work in the human experience. And we discovered this a long time ago in the caves of Neanderthals, and certainly the Greeks understood this. And what you see today, movies and TV shows are all variations on a theme. If it's not the hero's journey, it's an anti-hero. It's all working with our unconscious understanding of storytelling. So you may not consciously know how to tell a story, but you definitely unconsciously know what makes a good story. And that means you have a storyteller inside of you, just like everybody does. And if you feel that urge to tell a story, what you need is just to learn the technique, like to take that unconscious knowledge and make it conscious. And for that, there's a lot of great resources that you can easily access from anywhere in the world. Online classes, books you can order, seminars and lectures. There's probably way more now than there were when I was starting out, and maybe having too many choices can be part of the problem. I could see how that's the case, but I think you just need to learn how to do the actual work of it. Take a class, take a webinar, read a book, And then most importantly, start writing. Just pick up your laptop and go out there and make a plan, make a goal, and say, I'm going to write my first screenplay. It's going to take me 3 months. I'm not going to let myself take more than 3 months at it. And I know it's probably not going to be any good, but I'm going to do it from beginning to end. It's going to be 120 pages. There's going to be characters. There's going to be an arc. It's going to have a plot. And when I'm done, maybe I'm going to show it to some friends and see what they think. Or maybe I'm just going to throw it away and start again. But if you get out there and learn a little bit and start doing it, it's the only way, really, the only way to start screenwriting. And even though I said before it's a very hard field to break into, and that's true, making money as a screenwriter is one of the toughest things I think you can do. Any creative field, honestly, acting is similarly. It's also really rewarding. So don't worry about the financial part of it. Go after what fills you up about it. And if you find that screenwriting is filling you up and meaning something to you personally, I totally support you doing it with as much of your day as you want to do it, because it's a fantastic thing to do with your time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Okay, so that was the last one. So
Okay.
thank you very much, Brad. And
Absolutely.
have a nice day, and let's keep in touch.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk to you guys. I hope you got something out of this. And if any of you have a follow-up and that you were too shy to ask, please feel free to send it to one of the coordinators and they'll pass it along. I'm happy to send you an answer.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. Bye.